I have a map on my kitchen table that I bought from a gas station 20 years ago. It cost me $3.25, paid in exact change from the little cup I used to keep in my center console. The station doesn't exist anymore, or it does, but the exit that leads to it doesn't seem to be there when I look for it. I've driven that stretch of highway more times than I could count. I spent 26 years running freight along the I-40 corridor through northern Arizona and western New Mexico. And I can tell you every mile marker, every rest stop, every place the pavement dips, and the trailer shutters. I know where the cell signal dies east of Winslow. I know where the sky turns a particular purple just before dark, out near Sanders, that I've never seen anywhere else in the world. But I can't find the exit. The map is still here, though. Cream-colored paper, heavier than normal, folded into thirds. Pencil and ink, all hand-drawn. The roads, the landmarks, the little crosshatch shading where the messes are, the careful block letters naming towns and turnoffs. And the thing about that map is, it was right. Everything on it was right. I just wasn't ready to understand what right meant. My name is Ray Purcell. Seems 67 years old, and I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Tucson that I've been renting since 2014. Before that, I was in the cab of a Peterbilt 379 for most of my adult life. I ran overnight freight, dry goods, mostly sometimes produced depending on the season, between Flagstaff and Albuquerque, with seasonal loops that took me down through Las Cruces and up toward Gallup. I was good at it, not in a special way, just in the way that a person gets good at anything they do 5 or 6 nights a week for decades. I knew the truck, I knew the road. I knew my body's rhythm in the dark, when to eat, when to pull over and walk around the cab twice, when to let the coffee go cold, because the warmth in my hands was doing more than the caffeine at that point. I liked the work. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't running from anything, or at least I didn't think I was. The road just made sense to me. I liked the quiet. I liked the hours between midnight and 4 when the desert opened up around you and the only other lights were distant trucks heading the opposite direction, their headlights shrinking to pins in the side mirrors. I liked the hum of the engine settling into that low, steady register it found around 62 miles an hour, where the whole cab vibrated just enough that you could feel the road in your teeth if you relaxed your jaw. I called it the frequency. Other guys probably did too. You don't drive that long without developing a relationship with the machine. I got divorced in '93. Linda. We married young, and it was fine for a while, and then it was less fine. Then one day she sat me down at the kitchen table, a different kitchen table, different life, and said, "Ray, I need you to understand that you're a good man and I'm not angry, but I've been alone in this marriage for 6 years and I can't keep pretending the phone calls count." She was right. I wasn't home, not because I didn't love her, but because I didn't know how to be still. She got the house. I got the truck and a storage unit in Flagstaff. That was fair. We stayed in touch, which I think speaks well of both of us. I tell you all that so you understand the shape of the life I was living in October of 1997 when I first found the station. It was a Thursday. Late freight run. I'd picked up a load of canned goods and paper products in Flagstaff around 8 in the evening and was heading east on I-40 toward Albuquerque. Delivery window was Friday morning 6 to 10, so I had time. The weather had been changing all week. That early desert autumn where the air can't decide if it's still summer or not, and the temperature drops 40 degrees between noon and midnight. There was a little rain, not enough to slow you down, just enough to make the windshield interesting, the wipers going back and forth, the road shining in the headlights with that wet black gloss. I had the radio on, AM, because that's all that worked reliably out there in those days, and even that was patchy. I'd been listening to a Tucson country station that I could usually hold until just past Holbrook, when it would start to flutter and fade. There's a stretch east of there, maybe 20 miles, where the land flattens out and the signal just gives up. You get static, then a few bars of something from a station you can't identify, then static again. I never minded it. The static was part of the drive. It was weather, in a way, atmospheric noise. You learn to let it be. Somewhere east of mile marker 300, I noticed a road sign. Now, I need to say this clearly. I had driven that corridor hundreds of times, maybe 1,000. I knew every exit, every service sign, every faded billboard for turquoise shops and roadside attractions that had closed before I was born. I knew the green reflective signs and the mile markers and the way the rumble strips sounded different, depending on whether the shoulder was asphalt or gravel. I knew this road the way you know the hallway in your own house, not by looking, but by feel. I had never seen this sign before. It was small. Not a highway standard sign, more like a county marker, the kind you see on rural routes when someone's put up directions to a local business. White background, dark letters slightly crooked on its post. It said, Road Services, 2MI, with an arrow pointing right toward what looked like a gravel turnoff that angled away from the interstate and dropped below the sight line of the highway. My fuel was fine. I had 3/4 of a tank and a thermos of coffee that was still warm. I didn't need anything. But I noticed the sign, which felt strange in itself, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because it was new, or not new. It looked old. The letters were slightly faded, the post was weathered wood. It looked like it had been there for years, which meant I had been passing it for years without seeing it. That's the kind of thing that bothers you at 1 in the morning on an empty highway. Not in a frightening way, more like an itch in your memory. You start running through your mental map. Was that sign always there and I just never needed to look? Was there construction that shifted the road? Did I always pass this stretch in the other lane? I almost didn't turn. But the rain picked up slightly, and the sign caught my headlights just right, and I had that particular kind of highway restlessness where you've been driving long enough that any break in the pattern feels like permission. So I took the turnoff. The gravel road dropped down from the highway embankment and curved gently south. I could still see the interstate lights behind me rising above the sage. The road was well maintained, no washboards, no deep ruts rates, which surprised me. Service roads out there tended to be afterthoughts, the kind of thing ranchers graded once a season and forgot about. This felt like someone drove it regularly. About 1.5 miles in, the road leveled out and I saw the station. It was small. 2 pumps, the old style, with the mechanical dials that clicked over gallon by gallon. A flat-roofed building, concrete block painted white a long time ago. A covered area in front with 2 metal patio chairs, the kind that used to be in every backyard in America, and a standing coffee machine. The coin-operated type that dispensed into a cup the way they used to work in bus stations. There was a hand-painted price board near the pumps. The prices were reasonable but not suspiciously low. A neon sign in the front window said open, pale green, though the O flickered with a slight irregularity, like a pulse that wasn't quite steady. I pulled in, set the brake, and sat in the cab for a minute. I do that sometimes when I stop at an unfamiliar place late at night. You let the engine idle, you look around, you listen. Not out of fear, out of habit. You learn to read a place before you step into it. The station looked fine. It looked normal. It looked, if I'm honest, like something from about 20 years earlier. Not abandoned or neglected, maintained, cared for. But the aesthetic was older. The pump style, the signage, the chairs, the coffee machine. It all felt like the late 70s. Like someone had kept everything working but never updated anything. I got out. The air was cool and clean. That high desert cold that comes in through your collar and wakes you up better than caffeine. I could smell creosote from the rain, that sharp green resin smell that the desert produces when water hits certain plants. It's the most honest smell I know. Nothing else smells like it. Nothing else even tries. The door to the station was open, propped with a small wedge of wood. Inside it was bright, fluorescent, humming faintly. There was a counter with a register, a few shelves of basic supplies, motor oil, wiper fluid, wrapped sandwiches in a small refrigerator case, aspirin, a wire rack of sunglasses. Normal, all normal. Behind the counter was a man, 60s, maybe a lean 65, tan in the way that comes from decades, not seasons. Clean-shaven, thin-faced, with eyes that were either hazel or gray depending on where the fluorescent light caught them. He wore a green vest over a flannel shirt. His name tag said Hap. He looked up when I came in, nodded once, and said, "Evening." I nodded back. "Saw your sign off the interstate. Don't think I've noticed it before." "Been there a while," he said. Not defensive, not corrective, just factual, the way you'd say the sun came up. I bought a coffee from the machine outside, dropped a quarter in, and it poured a heavy, dark cup that smelled better than it had any right to. There was a ceramic mug on a hook beside the machine, the kind with no logo, cream-colored and solid enough that you could feel the weight of it in your wrist. I looked back toward the door. Hap caught my eye through the glass and made a small gesture. "Go ahead." The coffee was good. I mean genuinely good, in a way that gas station coffee never is. I stood under the covered area, holding the mug with both hands, watching the rain come down on the gravel lot and listening to my truck idle. For a moment, everything was very peaceful. Just the rain, the engine, the hum of the neon sign, and the taste of hot coffee at 1:30 in the morning in the middle of nowhere. I went back inside to use the restroom and pay for the coffee. On the way to the counter, I passed a wire rack near the register, the rotating kind, like the ones that used to hold postcards in tourist shops. But it didn't hold postcards. It held maps. Folded paper maps, different sizes, different ages. Some were clearly printed, the kind you'd buy at any gas station in the 90s. But most of them were different, hand-drawn. Cream-colored paper, heavier than normal, folded into thirds with careful precision. I could see ink lines through the folds, roads, intersections, tiny block letter town names. I pulled one out. It was dense with detail, not just roads, but landmarks. Water towers, cattle guards, dry wash crossings, a church marked with a tiny cross, a junction labeled with a name I didn't recognize. Halloran. These local? I asked. Hap looked at the map in my hand, then at me. Some of them. Who draws them? He paused, not a long pause, but the kind where you can tell someone is choosing between two answers. They've been around a while, he said. I turned the map over. The back was blank. The paper smelled faintly of something I couldn't place, not ink, not dust. Something older. Like the inside of a wooden drawer that hasn't been opened in years. How much? That one's $3.25. I paid him an exact change for my console cup. He put the coins in the register without counting them, like he already knew the amount. I folded the map and slipped it into my jacket pocket. It felt heavier than paper should. I thanked him, returned the mug to its hook, and walked back to the truck. The rain had softened to almost nothing. Just a mist now, catching the green neon in tiny suspended drops. I climbed into the cab, released the brake, and pulled back onto the gravel road toward the highway. In the mirror, the station's light shrank to a point and then disappeared behind the sage. I merged back onto I-40 heading east and finished my run without incident. Delivered the load Friday morning, slept at the Albuquerque yard, and headed back west the next night. I didn't think about the map again until the following morning, at a truck stop in Holbrook, sitting in a booth with a plate of eggs and a road atlas open in front of me. I pulled the map from my jacket and unfolded it on the table beside the atlas. The hand-drawn roads were clear, precise, confident. Whoever had made this knew the terrain, the way the washes ran, the way the roads curved around certain formations. I traced the route with my finger. It showed a turnoff from a road I recognized, heading south into Mesa country, passing through 3 named locations, a junction called Miller's Cross, a dry lake labeled Playas Blanca, and a town, Halloran. I looked at the atlas. Miller's Cross wasn't on it, Playas Blanca wasn't on it, Halloran wasn't on it. I checked the legend, the index in the back, nothing. I'd brought a second atlas, a Rand McNally I kept in the cab, and checked that too. No Halloran, no Miller's Cross, nothing. I sat there for a while, chewing my eggs, looking at this map that showed 3 places that didn't seem to exist. Then I flagged down a driver I recognized, a guy named Mitch, who'd been running the Southwest since before I started. He came over, coffee in hand, and I showed him the map. He squinted at it, turned it sideways, then tapped the word Halloran with his finger. There was a Halloran, he said. Mail stop. 40s, maybe 50s. Little nothing place on a ranch road south of the highway. Hasn't been anything there since before I started driving. You sure? Pretty sure. Might have been a well station or a relay point. One of those places that existed because the postal route needed a name on the map. He slid the map back to me. Where'd you get this? I told him about the station. Mitch frowned, not concerned, just confused. Off the service road east of 300, I don't know any station out there. He shrugged. Could be new. Could be I just never stopped. I folded the map back into thirds and put it in my jacket. The paper was warm, the way paper gets when it's been sitting in sunlight, except there was no sunlight. The booth was under a fluorescent bar that buzzed the same way the station's lights had buzzed, and for a moment I felt a strange doubling. Like I was in 2 places at once, or like the light itself was the same light, stretched across 60 miles of desert. I shook it off, finished my eggs, paid the check. But I kept the map in my jacket pocket for the rest of that week, and sometimes, at night, sitting in the cab waiting for a loading dock to open, or a dispatcher to call back, I'd take it out and unfold it under the dome light. The roads were always the same. The town names were always the same. Halloran was always there, sitting at the end of a route that led through 2 places nobody had heard of, drawn in careful ink on paper that smelled like the inside of something that had been closed for a very long time. I didn't follow it, not yet. I told myself I'd forgotten about it, that it was a curiosity and nothing more. Some local eccentric art project, a hand-drawn map to places that used to exist, sold for pocket change at a gas station that catered to drivers who liked interesting things on their dashboards. But I kept unfolding it, And each time I did, I noticed the same thing that I couldn't quite explain and didn't want to look at too closely. The map was warm, every single time. It was 11 months before I found the station again. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I didn't spend 11 months searching. I spent maybe the first 3 weeks watching for the sign, slowing down near mile marker 300 on my eastbound runs, scanning the right shoulder for the gravel turnoff, looking for the white face of that county-style marker in my headlights. Not once. And after 3 weeks, I stopped looking. Because 3 weeks is about how long it takes for something strange to settle into the background noise of a working life. You file it. You move on. The loads don't stop because you saw a sign that isn't there anymore. But the map stayed in my jacket. I told myself it was because I didn't have a better place to put it. That was true, technically. My apartment in Flagstaff was really just a room I kept clothes in. A one-bedroom above a laundromat that I used maybe 6 nights a month. The truck was my real home, and in the truck, things either had a place or they got lost. The map fit neatly into the inside pocket of my canvas jacket, right behind my logbook, and I could feel its edge against my chest when I leaned forward in the seat. After a while, it became part of the weight of the jacket, like the pen in the breast pocket or the spare key I kept zipped into the lining. I stopped noticing it, or I told myself I did. What I actually did, if I'm honest, was take it out every few days and look at it, not study it, not plan a route. Just look, there's a difference. Studying is active. You're comparing, measuring, asking questions. Looking is something else. It's the way you look at a photograph of someone you used to know. You're not trying to learn anything new. You're just sitting with the fact that it exists. The map never changed. The roads were the same. The town names were the same. Halloran still sat at the far end of a route that wound through empty country I couldn't verify. The ink was the same blue-black. The pencil shading on the mesas was the same careful crosshatch. But I started noticing something I hadn't paid attention to before. Something I'd only glimpsed that first morning in the truck stop. Under the surface lines, beneath the roads and the town names and the landmarks, there were faint markings. Very faint. Not erasure marks. More like a second layer, drawn lighter, maybe with a harder pencil or a thinner nib. I could only see them at certain angles and only under certain light. In the cab, under the dome light at night, I could just make out what looked like additional text. Tiny block letters, the same hand, but compressed, almost hidden. Like margin notes that had been pushed underneath the map's real content. I tried reading them once, parked at a loading dock in Gallup at 2 in the morning. I held the map up to the dome light and tilted it slowly. I could make out fragments. What looked like a name, maybe a first name, 4 or 5 letters. What might have been a date, and a number that could have been a distance or a highway designation. But the light was too yellow and the lines were too faint, and my eyes were too tired, and after a few minutes I folded it back up and put it away. The next time I looked, at a rest stop near Grant's under a sodium parking light, the fragments seemed different. The name looked longer. The date had moved, not its position on the paper, but its content, as if a different date was written there now. I couldn't be sure. I told myself it was the light. Sodium lamps turn everything amber and flatten depth. Pencil lines would look different under different sources. That's not supernatural, that's just optics. I believed that for a while. Through the winter and into the spring of '98, I drove my regular corridor and kept the map in my jacket, and occasionally unfolded it and looked at the undermarkings and told myself it was a curiosity. A well-made piece of folk cartography with some annotations I couldn't quite read. The station was probably still out there. Maybe I was just missing the turnoff because I was always driving at night, and the sign was small and I was focused on the road. These things happen. You drive the same stretch 500 times, and then one night you notice a house you've never seen, set back from the highway behind some trees, and you think, how is that possible? I've been looking at this road for years. But the house was always there. You just never had a reason to see it. That's what I told myself. What finally made me go looking deliberately was something that had nothing to do with the map. In August of '98, I had a week off between contracts. My carrier was switching dispatch systems and there was a gap while they reassigned routes. I spent most of it in Flagstaff in my apartment doing nothing in particular, laundry, errands. Sitting on the narrow balcony that overlooked the parking lot behind the laundromat, drinking coffee and watching the afternoon storms build over the peaks. It should have been restful. It wasn't. I realized, sitting there on the 3rd or 4th day, that I didn't know what to do with still time. I didn't have hobbies. I didn't have friends in Flagstaff. I had people I nodded to at the diner and the parts store, but no one I'd call. I hadn't spoken to anyone except a dispatcher and a dock supervisor in 6 days. I called Linda. She picked up on the second ring. "Ray," she said, not surprised, not annoyed. Just my name placed into the conversation like a bookmark. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. She told me about her sister's new house. I told her about the dispatch changeover. She asked if I was eating real food. I said mostly. She said mostly wasn't an answer. We laughed a little. It was the kind of conversation we'd been having 5 years since the divorce. Warm, careful, honest about everything except the thing underneath it, which was that I missed her, and she knew I missed her, and neither of us was going to say it because saying it would mean admitting that the problem hadn't been love. The problem had been that I couldn't stop moving. After we hung up, I sat on the balcony for a long time. The coffee went cold in my hand. I thought about the apartment, the empty rooms behind me, the way the light came through the kitchen window and fell on a counter where nothing was being prepared, where no one was standing, where the only sound was the refrigerator cycling on and off. And then I thought about the station. Not the map, not the mystery, just the station. The metal chairs under the awning, the coffee machine that took quarters, the way the air smelled like creosote and rain, the quiet, the way Hap had nodded at me like I was expected, not in a strange way, but in the way a bartender nods at a regular, except I'd never been there before. I wanted to go back. The next night, I drove east on I-40 after dark. No freight, no schedule, just my truck and the highway. I slowed near mile marker 300 and watched the shoulder. Nothing. I drove to 310, turned around at an emergency crossover, and drove back. Nothing. I did this 3 times. The sign wasn't there. The gravel turnoff wasn't there. The service road that had led me off the interstate and down the embankment and through the sage to that small, well-kept station was simply not present. On the 4th pass, I pulled over at the shoulder near marker 306 and sat in the cab with the engine idling. The night was clear. I could see the stars through the windshield, the thick band of the Milky Way that you only get in empty country far from cities. I sat there and felt foolish. Then I did something I hadn't done before. I turned off the headlights, let my eyes adjust. And I started driving again slowly, maybe 35, on the shoulder, watching the desert instead of the road. That's when I saw it. Not the sign. The service road. It was there. Running parallel to the highway, about 200 yards south, visible as a pale line through the brush. I'd been looking for the turnoff from the interstate, but the service road didn't connect to the interstate, not visibly. There was no marked exit, no ramp, no gap in the guardrail. The road was just there, below and to the right, like a path that belonged to a different system entirely. I found it by dropping off the highway at an unmarked gravel wash crossing near mile marker 308. Not a legal exit, just a place where the embankment was low enough that the truck could ease down without bottoming out. The gravel crunched under the tires. The service road met me at the bottom, solid and well-graded, heading east. A mile and a half later, the station appeared, same as before. 2 pumps, flat roof, metal chairs, coffee machine. The green neon open sign with its flickering O. The hand-painted price board. The propped open door with its wedge of wood. It was 1:14 in the morning. There was a car in the lot that wasn't mine, a dark-colored Subaru wagon with New Mexico plates, parked at the edge of the gravel near the air pump. And in one of the metal chairs sitting with her hands around a ceramic mug was a woman. She was in her mid-30s, brown hair pulled back, a fleece jacket over a plain shirt. She wasn't reading, wasn't looking at her phone. It was 98. Barely anyone had phones worth looking at. She was just sitting, staring at the dark the way you do when you've been driving long enough that stopping feels like the world went quiet too suddenly. I parked, set the brake, and got out. She glanced over. I nodded. She nodded back. I went inside. Hap was behind the counter. Same green vest. Same flannel shirt. Same quiet, unhurried eyes. If 11 months had passed for him, it didn't show. "Evening," he said. "Evening." I dropped a quarter into the coffee machine outside and filled the ceramic mug, the same mug, or one just like it, cream-colored and heavy with a hairline crack along the handle that I remembered running my thumb over the first time. The coffee was the same, dark, smooth, impossibly good for a coin-operated machine at a place that shouldn't exist. I took the other metal chair about 4 feet from the woman. We sat there together without speaking for a while. The desert was quiet. The neon hummed. My truck idled softly in the lot. That low 62-mile-an-hour frequency dropped down to a murmur. After a few minutes, she said, "You've been here before." It wasn't a question. I don't know how she knew. Maybe it was the way I used the mug or the way I sat down without hesitation or something less explainable. Once, I said. Last October. She nodded. I've been driving for 3 days. Since the funeral. She said it without preamble, without looking at me. The way you say things to strangers in the middle of the night that you'd never say to anyone who knew your name. My son. He was 11. I didn't say I was sorry. I know that sounds wrong, but I've learned that there's a kind of grief where sorry lands like a pebble on concrete. It just clicks and rolls away. So I said nothing. I sat with it. I let the space between us hold what she'd said without me trying to make it smaller. She took a sip of her coffee. I bought a map, she said. Inside. One of the hand-drawn ones. The man said it would show me a good route through the weather, but there's no weather tonight. There was some rain when I came through last time, I said. The route goes to a town I can't find on any map, she said. Mercy. She said the name like she was tasting it, like she wasn't sure whether it was a place or a diagnosis. I don't know if I'm going to follow it, she said. I don't know if I want to know where it goes. I understood that, more than she could have known. I had a map in my jacket pocket that led to Halloran, and I'd carried it for 11 months without following it, and I couldn't have told you whether that was caution or cowardice. We sat there a while longer. The neon flickered. The coffee cooled. At some point she stood up, set the mug on the chair, and walked to her car. She had an old Polaroid camera on the passenger seat, the chunky kind, white plastic with the rainbow stripe. She picked it up, turned back toward the station, and took a photograph. The flash lit the lot for an instant, blue-white, and then the camera whirred and pushed out the square of film. She shook it once, looked at it, and set it on the chair beside her mug. Then she got in the Subaru, started the engine, and pulled away. No goodbye, no wave. Just the crunch of gravel, the sweep of headlights across the sage, and then gone. I sat there for another minute, listening to the desert close back around the space where she'd been. Then I picked up the Polaroid. The image was still developing, the colors swimming up through that milky chemical fog the way they do. The station came into focus first. The building, the pumps, the neon sign, the awning, the chairs, all there, all clear. My truck was not in the photograph. I looked at the lot. My Peterbilt was parked right there, 15 feet from where the photo was taken, cab facing the building, running lights still on. In the photograph, that space was empty, just gravel, just air, as if the station existed and I didn't, or as if whatever the camera recorded operated on rules I hadn't been told about. I set the Polaroid back on the chair. I didn't keep it. I wish I had sometimes, but at the time I wasn't thinking about evidence. I was thinking about the woman and the map to Mercy she might or might not follow, and the fact that she'd lost a child 3 days ago and driven into the desert and found this place. And whether that was random, or whether the station had a way of being findable precisely when a person needed to find it. And I was thinking about my own map, the one in my jacket, the one that had been warm against my chest for 11 months, leading to a town that didn't exist anymore, drawn by a hand I'd never seen, sold to me by a man who was always behind the counter no matter what hour I arrived. I went back inside. The wire rack was still there by the register. The maps were different, not all of them, but some. New folds, different paperweights, different ink colors. And on the rack, on the bottom row, I saw a map that looked freshly placed. The paper was slightly damp, as if someone had just set it there. The fold was warm. I didn't pick it up. Not yet. Instead, I took my map, the Halloran map, the one I'd carried, and placed it back on the rack. I don't know why. It felt like the right thing to do, like returning a library book I'd kept too long. Hap watched me do it. He didn't react. He just watched the way a person watches something they've seen before. I'd like a new one, I said. Anyone in particular? I looked at the rack. Dozens of maps, hand-drawn and printed, folded and waiting. I didn't know what I was looking for. I reached for one near the middle, a fresh fold, cream-colored, heavy, and opened it. The route led south, past landmarks I recognized from the region. A mesa called Redtail, a cattle guard at a junction I'd seen from the highway, and at the end a town. Not Halloran. A different name, a name that meant nothing to me in that moment, but that I would carry for the rest of my life. Sable Creek. How much? I said. Hap looked at the map, then at me, and for the first time something shifted in his expression. Not alarm, not warning, something more careful, like a man measuring whether a thing is ready. That one's $3.50, he said. I paid him. Exact change again from the console cup. He put the coins in the register without counting them. I walked outside with the new map in my jacket. The night had gone very still. No wind, no traffic sound from the interstate, no coyotes. Just the neon and the dark and the faint smell of coffee and creosote hanging in the air like something left behind by someone who'd been standing there a moment ago. I climbed into the cab. My logbook was open on the passenger seat. I picked up my pen and wrote the date, October 14, 1998, and my starting mileage. Then I pulled onto the service road and headed back toward the highway. I drove the rest of that night with the new map folded in my jacket. I didn't open it again until I was back in my apartment in Flagstaff, standing at the kitchen counter in the morning light, unfolding it beside a cup of coffee that tasted thin and flat compared to the memory of the stations. The route to Sable Creek was detailed, careful, and led through country I'd never driven. I traced it with my finger. The roads looked real, specific, graded, purposeful. The landmarks were the kind only someone who'd walked or driven the terrain would know. A split juniper, a rusted stock tank, a wash crossing marked seasonal, and underneath the surface lines, faint as breath on glass, the undermarkings were there again, different from the ones on the Halloran map. New text, new fragments, new shapes I couldn't read. I held the map up to the kitchen window, morning sun, clean and direct, and for just a moment, under that bright, honest light, one of the undermarkings resolved into something legible, a name, written in small, careful letters beneath the word Saïd, Doris, my mother's name. I put the map down. I remember that very clearly, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a physical fact. I set it on the counter and stepped back from it the way you step back from a shelf that's about to give. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't pounding. I just needed to not be holding it for a moment. My mother's name was Doris Purcell née Whitfield. She was born in 1940, grew up somewhere in the rural Southwest. She was never specific about where, moved to Phoenix with her family when she was in her early 20s, married my father in 1964, had me in 1969, and spent the rest of her life in a two-bedroom house on the east side of the city. She was a quiet woman. Not cold, warm actually, in a steady low-heat way, like a furnace that never kicks into high but never goes out. She made chili that could strip paint. She read Zane Grey novels on the porch. She kept a clean house and a small garden, and she didn't talk much about the past. That was the thing. She didn't talk about it. Not the way people don't talk about things that were bad, with tension, with avoidance, with the shape of the silence giving away what's being hidden. She just didn't mention it. If you asked where she grew up, she'd say out near the border and change the subject. If you asked about her parents, she'd say they were good people who worked hard. If you pressed, and I only pressed once or twice, as a teenager, when I was in that phase of wanting to know where I came from, she'd look at you with an expression that wasn't pain, wasn't anger, but something closer to a door being gently closed. And you'd stop asking, not because you were afraid, but because the door was so clearly closed that pushing on it felt rude. She died in 2003. Heart failure, which the doctor said was not unusual for a woman her age who'd smoked through her 30s. I drove down from Flagstaff and sat with her in the hospital for 3 days. She was lucid until the last afternoon. The final thing she said to me that made sense was, "You drive too much, Ray." I thought she meant the trip down. I think now she meant something else. I never heard her say the name Sable Creek, not once, not in any context. So seeing it there, written in faint pencil beneath a town name on a hand-drawn map I'd bought from a gas station that may or may not exist depending on whether you're going slow enough to find the road, I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't have a framework for it. The map was strange, fine. The station was strange, fine. The undermarkings were strange, fine. I'd been filing all of it under curiosity for a year, and that filing system had been working well enough to keep me functional. But this was different. This was my mother's name in a stranger's handwriting on a map that wanted to take me somewhere she'd apparently been. I did what any reasonable person would do. I looked for a normal explanation. First, I considered coincidence. Doris is not a rare name. It could have been anyone's name annotated for any reason. Maybe the mapmaker knew a Doris who lived near Sable Creek. Maybe it was a label for a ranch or a homestead. The Doris Mine, the Doris Well, something geographic that happened to share a name with my mother. I wanted to believe that. I held on to it for about a day. Then I started checking. I went to the Flagstaff Public Library. This was before you could look up everything online, or at least before I knew how to. And I asked the reference librarian to help me find anything on a town called Sable Creek in Arizona or New Mexico. She was a patient woman, heavy-set, with reading glasses on a chain, and she didn't look at me strangely for asking. People came in with odd research questions all the time, she said. Genealogy does that. We found nothing. No Sable Creek in any current Arizona or New Mexico gazetteer. No listing in the USG's Geographic Names Information System. No mention in the state historical indexes she checked. She widened the search to include ghost towns and unincorporated communities, and that turned up a few partial hits. Sable, without the creek, was listed as a former railroad siding in southern New Mexico that had been abandoned in the 1930s. And Creek, without the Sable, showed up in half a dozen place names across both states. But Sable Creek as a combined name didn't appear anywhere. Doesn't mean it wasn't real, the librarian said, pulling off her glasses and letting them hang. Plenty of small places out here never made it into official records. Mail stops, ranch communities, places that only lasted a generation. If it was unincorporated and small enough, it might only exist in county assessor records or old postal route maps. She suggested I try the county records offices for the border counties, Cochise, Hidalgo, Grant. I wrote down the addresses. I thanked her. I walked out into the Flagstaff afternoon and sat in my truck in the library parking lot and knew, with a certainty I couldn't defend, that I wasn't going to find Sable Creek in any archive. Because the map wasn't showing me a place that existed in records. It was showing me a place that existed on the ground, in the dirt and the rock and the silence of the desert, the way the station existed. Real, physical, reachable, but not on any official map. Present but not documented. There, but only if you knew the road. I thought about calling my mother. It was August of '98. She was alive, living in the same house in Phoenix, probably sitting on the porch with a book. I could have called her and said, "Mom, does the name Sable Creek mean anything to you?" I could have asked. She might have answered. She might have closed the door again gently, the way she always did. I didn't call. I'm not proud of that. But I was afraid, not of what she might say, but of what her silence would confirm. If she said nothing, if she changed the subject, if her voice went flat the way it did when you bumped against whatever she was carrying, then I'd know the map was right. And I wasn't ready to know that. I drove my routes. I carried the new map. I didn't open it again for 3 weeks. But something had changed in the texture of my driving. The corridor felt different. Not dangerous, not wrong, just layered, the way a painting looks different once someone points out the brush strokes. I'd drive past mile marker 308 and feel the pull of the service road below the embankment, even though I couldn't see it. I'd tune through the AM band and pause when the static thickened in a particular way, listening for something underneath it, a frequency, a voice, a pattern. I never caught anything definite. Just the usual wash of atmospheric noise, the distant bleating of stations from Albuquerque and Phoenix, the occasional clear snatch of a preacher's voice or a weather report that always seemed slightly off in its phrasing, as if the forecast was for a day that had already passed. In September, I found the station again. I wasn't looking for it. I was on a westbound run, coming back from Albuquerque through light rain, and the service road just appeared. Not through the gravel wash crossing I'd used before, but through a different gap in the embankment, farther east near marker 314. The road was the same. The station was the same. The neon was the same. There was another truck in the lot, an older Freightliner white with a sleeper cab and plates I couldn't read in the dark. The driver was inside the station when I walked in. He was standing at the map rack, holding one of the hand-drawn maps unfolded in front of him, and he was reading it the way you read a letter, not a set of directions, slowly, with his lips slightly parted, as if the words were reaching him on a delay. He was older than me, 60, maybe 65, big through the shoulders in the way that men who loaded their own freight used to be, before everything went to forklifts and dock crews. His hands were enormous. His face had that blasted sandstone look of someone who'd spent decades squinting into sun and wind. His name, I learned later, was Earl. Hap was behind the counter. Same vest, same shirt. He nodded at me. I bought a coffee and came back inside and stood near the rack, not quite ready to interrupt. Earl looked up. He had the kind of eyes that registered you completely in a single glance, not unfriendly, just thorough. "You one of the regulars?" he asked. "I've been here twice before. This is my 4th time. Or 5th, he frowned. Might be 5th. That struck me. Not the number, but the uncertainty. A man who'd visited a place 4 or 5 times should know which one it was. "How long between visits?" I asked. He folded the map carefully, matching the creases, and set it on the counter. "That's the thing," he said. "I'm not sure. I think the last time was 3 weeks ago. But my logbook." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a standard driver's log, the spiral-bound kind we all used. He opened it to a page near the back and turned it toward me. The entries were neat, Date, origin, destination, mileage, fuel stops. Standard trucker shorthand. But the handwriting on the last several pages was different from the earlier entries. The letters were smaller, more precise, more carefully formed. Earl's own handwriting, visible on the pages before, was larger, looser, the kind of writing that comes from filling out the same form thousands of times without thinking about it. The newer entries were written by someone else. "That's not mine," Earl said. He said it calmly, the way you identify someone else's coat on a hook. Not alarmed, just factual. Last 8 entries. I don't remember writing them. I don't remember the stops. This one here, he pointed to an entry dated September 3rd, says I arrived at a place called Drywell, fueled at 3/4. Slept well. He looked at me. I don't sleep well. Haven't slept well in 9 years, not since my wife passed. I looked at the entry. The handwriting was beautiful, in a way. Confident, unhurried. It described a journey Earl didn't remember taking, to a place that sounded like one of the towns from my own map. "Have you been following the maps?" I asked. "I think so. I think I've been driving the routes, but I can't. It's like the memory of it is there, but it's behind glass. I know I drove. I know I stopped. I can feel the miles in my back. But the details are like somebody else's vacation slides." He didn't seem frightened. He seemed bewildered in a gentle, exhausted way, like a man who'd been doing math that wouldn't balance and had finally decided to show his work to someone else. "You think the maps are doing something," I said. "Not a question." "I think the maps know where they're going," he said. "I'm just not sure they care whether I'm driving or not." I bought Earl a coffee. We took the metal chairs outside and sat under the awning and listened to the desert. His Freightliner idled beside my Peterbilt, the 2 engines murmuring in slightly different registers, like 2 voices telling the same story with different accents. The rain had stopped, but the creosote smell was still there, hanging in the air, sharp and green and alive. Earl told me he'd started driving in the early 60s. He'd done everything: flatbed, tanker, refrigerated. He'd been through every state in the lower 48. His wife had traveled with him for the first decade, riding shotgun, keeping the logbook, reading paperback mysteries aloud during the long, straight stretches through Kansas and Nebraska. When she died, he kept driving. "Didn't know what else to do with the seat," he said. "Couldn't stand looking at it empty and couldn't bring myself to put anything in it." I understood that more than I wanted to admit. We didn't talk about the maps again that night. We sat there for an hour, 2 old truckers under a tin awning, drinking coffee that was too good for the place it came from, watching the dark. At some point I looked over and Earl had his eyes closed. Not sleeping, just resting. His face in the neon light looked like a landscape, like something weather had made. When I got up to leave, he opened his eyes and said, "You got one of the maps, the hand-drawn ones? Yeah, you follow it yet?" "No," he nodded, slowly. "You will." A pause. They're patient, those maps. They don't mind waiting. I drove back to the highway that night with the Sable Creek map in my jacket, and Earl's words sitting in my chest like a stone I'd swallowed. The logbook was open on the passenger seat. I wrote my mileage at the highway merge, 147,312. When I reached my delivery point in Winslow 6 hours later, I checked the odometer again, and 47,502, 190 miles. But the route from the station to Winslow, the way I'd driven it, back up to I-40, west through Holbrook, into Winslow, was 140 miles. I knew that. I'd driven it hundreds of times, 50 extra miles, unaccounted for. I hadn't stopped, hadn't detoured, hadn't left the interstate. The road was the road. The math should have worked. I sat in the Winslow lot and wrote in the margin of my logbook, next to the October 14th entry, "Time wrong or road wrong? Check later." I never checked. But that night, in the cab, waiting for the dock to open, I took out the Sable Creek map and held it up to the dome light. The undermarkings were there, shifting in the amber glow. Faint lines, faint text, faint architecture beneath the surface of a map that was trying to take me somewhere I'd never been. And my mother's name, still there beneath the town. Still legible. Still waiting. I thought about Earl's logbook, the beautiful handwriting that wasn't his, describing journeys he couldn't remember, to places that existed outside the system of roads and records that the rest of the world agreed on. I thought about the woman and her map to Mercy, and whether she'd followed it, and whether the town had been there when she arrived. I thought about Hap, behind the counter, always behind the counter, selling maps to people who drove into the desert at night, carrying grief and restlessness, and the particular kind of lostness that doesn't show up on any odometer. And I thought, for the first time, not as a theory but as a recognition, the way you recognize a face in a crowd that you didn't know you were looking for. that the maps weren't navigation tools. They weren't shortcuts or scenic routes or weather alternatives. They were something else entirely. They were personal. They were specific to the person who bought them. They led each traveler through a different landscape, even if the paper showed the same roads, because the destination wasn't geographic. The maps knew where you needed to go, not where you were trying to go, where you needed to go. The place you'd been driving around for years, or decades, circling it in the dark the way I circled my corridor between Flagstaff and Albuquerque, passing the same mile markers, the same rest stops, the same faded billboards, over and over, always moving, never arriving. And my map, my specific map, the one that cost $3.50 from a man in a green vest who looked at me like he was measuring something. My map led to a town my mother had never mentioned, where her name was written in a hand I didn't recognize underneath of a place that no archive could confirm. The map knew something about my mother, or it knew something about me, or, and this is the thought that kept me awake that night and many nights after, it knew something about the distance between us, the distance that wasn't miles, the distance that was silence and years, and all the questions I never asked because the door was always gently closed. I was going to follow the map, I knew that now. Not because I was brave, not because I'd solved anything, but because the alternative was to keep circling. Keep driving. Keep carrying a map that was warm against my chest and patient enough to wait until I was ready. Earl was right. The maps didn't mind waiting. But I was starting to understand that the waiting had a weight, and I'd been carrying it a lot longer than 11 months.